For the first panel, Inclusive Societies and Human Rights for Global Citizenship, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Claire Mahon, Brian Rusch, and Daniel Perell. Each of these speakers will make a short presentation, and then we will enjoy a panel discussion. Claire Mahon is Executive Director of the Global Human Rights Group and has extensive experience as a human rights defender and lawyer, including working for the UN and Amnesty International, consulting for governments, and mentoring young human rights defenders. Brian Rusch is a global charity strategist, diversity, equity, and inclusion professional, and is currently president of the groundbreaking Rotary Club for Global Action. He has worked internationally, including with global leaders such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and is a passionate advocate for human rights for all. He works tirelessly to inspire people, especially young people, to become change makers for peace. He is expert in creating youth peace programs, and this work has focused on developing educational programs for youth to inspire their own explorations of ethics and focus on reshaping conversations about peace, equality, and forgiveness. Daniel Perell's areas of work include social and sustainable development, climate change and the environment, global citizenship, human rights, and the role of religion in society. He is formerly a global organizing partner of the NGO Major Group and chair of the NGO Committee for Social Development. In 2010, Mr. Perell received a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law and an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts. He was admitted to the New York State Bar Association. He is currently co-chair of the Coalition for the UN We Need and was penholder on the 66th DPI NGO Conference Declaration on Education for Global Citizenship. Ms. Mahon, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nick. And hello to everybody, distinguished colleagues, global citizens, and representatives and members of civil society. First of all, I'd like to issue a big thank you to the organisers for inviting me along today. Although I'm thanking them, I also think it's a big responsibility to be up first, to be the presenter in a forum like this. And so I wanted to start by saying I began thinking about this topic, trying to think about what does global citizenship mean for me as a human rights defender and as a human rights activist. I've been working on human rights for over 20 years, and in that time I've worked with many grassroots communities, with frontline human rights defenders, those who are really at the communities who are most at risk and who are at the forefront of trying to protect and promote human rights for everybody. I've also had the immense privilege and honour of working with a number of global leaders on human rights, people who are very good at making sure that decisions that are made are done so with a human rights framework in mind and thinking about what it means to be inclusive in our approach to decision making. So with this background in mind, I wanted to think about human rights as being a human rights approach to global citizenry as part of this idea of the social contract that the previous speaker referred to, this idea that all of us as global citizens have rights and responsibilities. These rights and responsibilities are, in my view, best articulated by the underlying principles for a human rights-based approach, which are participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality, empowerment, and ensuring the rule of law. So if we take an approach to our thinking around what is global citizenship that brings these values of human rights to the forefront of our thinking, I think we have an approach which will inherently be inclusive and will help us to realize our aspirations when it comes to education and promotion of global citizenship. When we think about inclusion in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, as we all know, this means leaving nobody behind. And so in our global citizenship efforts, we must focus on those most at risk of being left behind. Luckily, a human rights approach helps us to do this. A human rights approach can also help us tell the story of how we contribute to global citizenship and how we can be effective partners for stakeholders, including governments. Governments have an imperative to make sure that their investments focus on the agenda of inclusion and leaving nobody behind. And this provides an enormous opportunity for us as NGOs and for the whole civil society community to use this narrative. Human rights is not just about guarding against the risk of doing things wrong. It's also about contributing to the realization of human rights for all. And this is a dichotomy that we are often in. And this is the idea that is behind what I want to talk to you about today, this idea of dichotomies. So for human rights, it's about this dichotomy between doing the right thing and also making sure that we're not doing the wrong thing. And we see this in many different parts of the work that we do. And I think it's also one of the challenges that we have with thinking about global citizenship and in thinking about how do we educate others around what global citizenship is. I think the challenge before us is to find a way of bridging these dichotomies. So these contrasts between two different aspects has been really, a great example of this has been shown to us during the COVID pandemic. So this global pandemic has provided us with a really illustrative example. So for the last couple of years, this pandemic that we've been suffering from has left everyone with a profound sense of loss. The loss of life to our global community has been horrific. And so too, we've had this heightened inequality between those who have access to resources, those who have decent employment, those who are able to access healthcare, and those who do not. These inequalities and the dichotomies that they create are often most clear when we look at the people and groups who are most at risk at being left behind in our global push for development. So on the one hand, many of our global workplaces have undergone fundamental shifts that have been necessitated by the pandemic. These have helped to make spaces safer, more inclusive, easier to navigate, and more accommodating for people with disabilities, for example. The idea of working from home, remote working, flexible working hours, these have long been asked for by members of our diverse workforces, and now they're the norm for many places. Yet in many other ways, people with disabilities have been the most disadvantaged by these changes. People who don't already have easy access to the internet or to education that can be conducted online, those who don't have access to work environments that can be shifted remotely. These are the people that continue to be further disadvantaged by crises like the global pandemic. And this inability to access social protection, to use the help of support workers when it comes to the disability community, all of these things mean that those who are already most vulnerable are at risk of having the gap widen further and further. This is just one way in which we see this dichotomy play out, and our global citizenry ideas need to take into account what inclusivity really means in this context. So in many ways, our global society has become more inclusive, but it's also become more divisive. So for example, the use of the human rights language in the debate around freedoms and the protection of the right to health. There's a fine line between protecting the rights and freedoms of individuals and our communities. And as communities have grown in awareness about the concept of human rights, so too we've seen a growing in the co-opting of human rights language. And human rights language is now being used as a tool by various communities to create divisions rather than to build inclusivity. So when it comes to the role of civil society in global citizenship, we want to see how can we continue to value this contribution, particularly the contribution of NGOs and like ours, and the importance of listening to the voices that civil society brings. And how can we balance that against the efforts that are used to silence us? As a human rights defender, I couldn't possibly come to a forum like this and not talk about how the same tools that we use to coalesce are the tools that are being used to silence us as human rights defenders. So, for example, the technology that we use to connect with each other is also being used to surveil us and to stifle the expression of civil society. We see many different movements that are trying to promote inclusive societies and contribute to global citizenship. But in order for those to be successful, we need strong advocacy to ensure the voices of those most at risk are being heard. And these dichotomies exist no matter who we're talking about. For example, throughout the world, we've seen a great acceptance of groups representing diversity and inclusion for people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. But on the other hand, we also see more than ever violence enacted by state and non-state actors against the LGBTI community. So no matter which group we're talking about, we need to think about not just what is the role of education, which is fundamental to this idea of global citizenship, but also how can we make sure that the inclusion aspect is something that is a positive force? How can we ensure that while we're being more aware and raising awareness of the need for inclusion, that we're also protecting ourselves and our fellow civil society members and being good allies along the way? We need to continue to represent perspectives that are hard to hear. And these risks and challenges that come when we use the human rights as a journey are important to consider when we're thinking about global citizenship. When we think about global citizenship, we need to make sure that these are aligned with our values around human rights. And I propose that this gives us a great power when it comes to defining what global citizenship means for us. We need to remember that human rights is not just about preventing problems, but it's contributing to the realization of human dignity for all. And that's what this dichotomy around human rights is really about. It's not just about mitigating potential negative consequences, but it's using things like education for global citizenship in order to proactively take steps to improve our world. So therefore, in my view, the answer lies in the values that are at the foundation of a human rights-based approach: participation, empowerment, equality, accountability, and a shared and accurate understanding about the rule of law. An inclusive approach to global citizenship must first and foremost be participatory, ensuring those who are most affected are given full and meaningful opportunities to shape the decisions that affect them. And there's no dichotomy between participation and empowerment, rather harmony and synergy when these values are activated and when the realization of human rights is at the heart of our inclusive approach to global citizenship.
Thank you, Ms. Mahon, for that very interesting and passionate presentation. I think we can all take something away from the highlighting of this dichotomy, as you put it. And I know that in recent weeks, UNESCO's own progress on ethics and AI is advancing that discussion, especially as we live in a world that requires these remote connections, but also, as you put it, presents issues for good and for bad, or right and wrong. Thank you very, very much. I now have the pleasure to hand over to Mr. Brian Rusch, who is president of the Rotary Club for Global Action and is based in the United States. Mr. Rusch, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you to all the organizers. Good morning from California. Good day to everybody else around the world. You know, I'm grateful to be here today. I think as we consider what it means to be a global citizen, I personally am reminded of a South African philosophy that I first learned from Archbishop Tutu, that is Ubuntu, which loosely translates to I am because we are. My humanity is tied up, it's inextricably bound up in yours, and we can only be human together. And I feel like this Ubuntu concept is instrumental to our understanding of what it means to be a global citizen. As Claire mentioned, a key pillar of the SDGs is leave no one behind. If we're going to be eradicating poverty and create a sustainably developed world, if we're going to work to becoming global citizens, we need to include all members of our society. And I feel this is especially important as it relates to the LGBTQ+ community, who tend to be excluded because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, or their sex characteristics. Now, it's interesting because the SDGs never explicitly mention sexual or gender identity or minorities. However, the goals themselves are based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in human rights. So when I think about what this means to be free and equal, and the need to have these rights that are given to us by our communities, I'm reminded of a trip that I took a few years ago. I've been instructed not to mention any countries, so we'll just say that I went to a place that didn't have such a great track record on human rights for LGBTQ plus citizens. And while on stage there, I mentioned that if this particular country was interested about becoming part of the modern world, it needed to start addressing the rights of women and girls, of people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ plus community. The backlash that I faced after making that comment was absolutely insane. I had death threats that as soon as I got off stage, and when I flew to Frankfurt that evening, when I checked my Twitter feed, it was just a row of people calling for my deaths. And I have to admit that this experience was overwhelming, because for me, it was the first time as someone who lives in California that I'd really experienced this level of vitriol. But you know, something amazing came out of this. People that were in attendance reached out to me via Facebook and Twitter, Instagram and WhatsApp. Young people who are just reaching out to thank me. People who've been struggling with their sexuality, and really who lived in areas where their lives would in fact be in danger if they were to come out, were messaging me to thank me for being an example of someone living my life authentically. And while this country was unique, the UN reports that the reality is currently it is illegal to be LGBTQ plus in at least 72 countries. And in 5 countries, people are identified as such can be put to death immediately. We're at risk of harassment, hate speech, physical violence, and in many communities, LGBTQ plus citizens have a higher likelihood of homelessness, poverty, and poor health. Last year in my own country, there were more transgender murders reported since we started keeping records until this year. 20% of the hate crimes that are reported by the FBI are based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So when we explore the SDGs and how we incorporate that our work as nonprofits to become a global citizen, how do we support the rights of LGBTQ plus people in our work and programs? SDG 10 focuses on reducing the inequalities within and among countries. Target 10.2 states that by 2030, we will empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, or other status. Now, there are certain entities in the world that would seek to discriminate against us, and they argue that this other status does not include the LGBTQ plus community. However, it's commonly interpreted by most organizations that this other status is meant to include the LGBTQ plus community. SDG 1, eradicating poverty in all of its forms, becomes discrimination and exclusion globally. You know, the LGBTQ plus community is much more vulnerable to poverty than heterosexual people. SDG 4 seeks to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education to promote lifelong learning opportunities to everyone. But the reality is LGBTQ plus youth are often excluded from educational opportunities. And when they do get those opportunities, they often face bullying and harassment that forces them to give these opportunities up, thus further contributing to a cycle of poverty. SDG 8 focuses on promoting exclusive economic growth, productive employment, and decent work for all. But fewer than half of the countries in the world today offer any protections whatsoever for LGBTQ plus individuals in the workplace, leaving much of the community exposed to both formal and informal measures of discrimination in the workplace. You know, it wasn't too long ago I was working for an organization, and when I started working there, I was warned that I shouldn't act too gay, because people that, if they found out I was, would stop working with us immediately. Now, first and foremost, I have never in my life been asked to do something like this, and it was incredibly awkward for me. Having to hide who I am and to conceal a portion of my life just didn't feel right. I've been publicly out since I was 19, and I've been happily married for over 25 years. Now I'm being asked to hide all of this, and what exactly is too gay? The reality is I'm not acting. It's just myself. I mean, I am who I am, and part of that includes being gay. But am I too gay? I don't know. At the time, I was working to address a global issue that was related to my personal sexuality. And I decided that it would be good for me to be somewhat circumspect in my behavior and my language and not talk about certain things. I was wrong, and you know, it didn't feel right. So since then, I've moved on from that position, and there was a lot of variety of reasons, but I will have to say that this was a key factor into that. And I can tell you that since then, I'm working on a new project, and I'm working with all these same faith leaders who I was working with previously, and there's absolutely no issue whatsoever. And I realized from that day that I need to make a commitment to be myself, my authentic self, no matter what. And if that means I'm going to lose clients, that's okay. I get to work with the Nobel laureates, and I work with faith leaders and celebrities and political leaders from around the globe. And most importantly, I get to work with young people, and to be anything other than who I am, other than my authentic self, it not only does a disservice to me, but it does a disservice to all LGBTQ plus people in the world who need a voice, who need us to stand fast in our authenticity. You see, an important way that that the culture is going to evolve is through visibility. Now, as we focus on this becoming global citizens, I think it's important for all of us as organizations and the organizations that we work with to start factoring in how we can include LGBTQ plus communities into our efforts and our programs. And that's not just within our organizations themselves, but actually the work that we're doing on the ground. What is it that we can do to help lift up these communities through our work, through our projects, through our services that we're offering to them? You know, we live in this beautifully diverse world, and we need to work together to value that diversity so that every one of us can achieve our own visions of peace and prosperity. Now, as we're moving forward into an awesome future, I ask that you all remain authentic to yourselves, and by being allies to others who are being authentically themselves, we can break out of our comfort zones, talk to people who are going to be different than us and who we're definitely going to disagree with, but we can find some common ground, and all of us need to take action. Remember that all of this is something that ties us all together is Ubuntu. My humanity is bound up in yours, and we can only be human together. Thanks.
Thank you, Rusch, for that stirring and very personal presentation. I would really like to draw out two specific things you said right at the start, which obviously continued as a theme, but which to me, knowing you personally, are very much a focus of what you do. We can only be human together, and that living authentically is both necessary and the only way that we can be human together. So thank you very, very much for your contribution. I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Daniel Perell, who joins us from New York. Thank you. Mr. Perell, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick, and to all colleagues who are here. And I want to just, before diving into prepared remarks, acknowledge the wonderful and courageous work of both Claire and Brian, who preceded me. They really are examples of this reality that we're all created with inherent nobility, regardless of any of our characteristics, be they physical, mental, sexual, linguistic, cultural, national, you name it. We must always be encouraging those who are trying to advance the truth of our inherent nobility. So just thank you to Claire and Brian for their work. So my intervention is a bit more at the conceptual level, but hopefully it can contribute just a small part to how all of our individual pieces fit together to form a collective whole. So what I hope to present today are three basic ideas. First is that the decisions taken by us as individuals and us as a species are based upon certain conceptions and underlying assumptions. These assumptions often defy perfect logic, of course. We're not robots, but they should be considered and reconsidered in light of new information. Second, today's moment in history represents really a clear opportunity to reconsider these assumptions. How we are behaving is not entirely commensurate, of course, with the needs of humanity today. And third, it's that this concept of global citizenship, despite the tremendous structural, social, and even narrative barriers it faces, represents a source of great hope and potential to advance humanity beyond its current understanding. So let's start from the top. What are our underlying assumptions as individuals and as a species? So just to use this analogy, which is often utilized in the Baha'i faith, which I do represent at the United Nations, is that if we consider humanity as one body and each member of that, the global family, one of the constituent elements of that body, then we have to consider what it is that drives the body's behavior. Just as you or I individually have underlying assumptions that guide our actions, what we choose to eat and when, whether we lock our homes, how we spend our resources of time, money, and the like, how we communicate with others, the global body of humanity too follows a certain set of normative behaviors. We may not be able to fully describe why we take any particular action. Is it the result of unspoken lessons learned when we were young, a response to a direct experience we once had? Just as an example, my 7-year-old daughter has a mortal fear of dogs because she was once knocked over by one when she was 18 months old. She can't remember that incident, but the fear is firmly implanted in her psyche. Was it something explicitly taught in school? Was it social forces from those who are behaving in like manner? Religious teachings from those we consider to be higher powers? One can very easily imagine that the actions of humanity as a whole are likewise determined by an aggregation of these various factors in some combination. And one could even go so far as to call this culture and say that this is what's passed down from generation to generation. Now, just as a quick aside, I'd like to flag that the complexity both of the human family and of the human body. Of course, each of us contains billions of constituent elements, cells, organs, and the like, with differing priorities and objectives. Some of these may even be contradictory. But when working in concert, there's a certain harmony. So it is with the body of humanity. Diversity is necessary for our vitality, ingenuity, and progress, but a diversity that works to better the whole of humanity rather than a diversity that seeks to advance its own narrow interests over others. So the question before us is, how do we, first as individuals and then as societies, and eventually as the corpus of humanity, make changes to our behavior? What makes me reduce my meat consumption, for example, is mounting evidence that the climate expense is unsustainably high, the crisis urgent, to a point worthy of this sacrifice. After witnessing a friend suffer terribly from a bike accident without a helmet, I'll always wear one. While it's not so complicated to identify the sources of change at an individual level, given the systemic shortcomings we face, we must also be trying to analyze this at the level of society. What elements were present in society that finally gave women the right to vote? What was the tipping point that led to the end of apartheid? In other words, what are the lessons being taught to humanity? And more importantly, are we as a species able to learn them? How can we move the needle on our collective consciousness in order to shed our outworn habits and encourage new patterns of collective life? The lessons are now unmistakably clear, from our economic interdependence with the trading of goods and services, our biological interdependence with the universal, though diverse spread of diseases, the impacts of climate change. There's no doubt anymore that the first assumption for each of us must be that we are one species in one shared homeland. We are essentially one body. So this brings me to the second point. Our current approaches are not commensurate with the needs of humanity today, and that this moment is an excellent opportunity to reassess. A recognition of our shared destiny as a species may seem simple, but to continue the human body analogy, when I stub my toe or fall prey to a paper cut, my whole body responds, so the pain and damage is entirely localized. There's a moment when everything my body is doing is sacrificed to survey the incident and determine if further action is necessary. So it should be with the body of humanity, and yet this is not how the global corpus responds to a comparable injustice. A tragedy in one part of the world rarely causes all of humanity to stop and reflect, with the exception of literally exceptional events. It is more often than not diluted by geographic and temporal distance. And yet we see really strong rhetoric these days. Calls for global solidarity ring loud and clear the world over in response to the pandemic or racial inequality. Human rights violations in one part of the world cause citizen movements to take shape in another. The limits to political borders we have established and now call countries, these are being questioned in light of our globally shared climate. Our ability for the majority of citizens, and especially the structures of society, to behave with such a recognition of our shared destiny, this is what's inhibited by legacies of behavior and perhaps more impactfully structural arrangements ill-suited to today's needs. This moment of humanity's contradiction can be summed up with the following clear example, at least clear to me. We have the ingenuity and capacity to create a vaccine that can stave off a pandemic, a challenge to our collective well-being as a species, of course. We can set up in name a system for its global distribution. Yet when this is mapped onto the outdated systems of nationalism and profit-seeking, we're utterly unable to bring the high rhetoric to a lived reality and properly distribute the vaccine or develop institutional capacity for its administration. This is setting aside even the challenge of mistrust based on legitimate skepticism born of a checkered history, which prevents those who have access from taking it. In a sense, a mistrust is passed on from generation to generation. All of this collectively risks the reality that variants will continue to plague us. So to say that humanity's collective psyche is analogous to the psyche of an individual is helpful in as much as it can offer a new way of thinking about the lessons we need to learn. While the application of these lessons may have different implications for different parts of that collective, so societies are like different organs of the body, the first step towards appropriate responses to the challenges we must face has to be a reassessment of the narratives that continue to dictate our reactions to these challenges. Where do we turn to ensure that these narratives shift and then become the script that dictates our actions? How do we ensure that these new narratives are embedded in our structures and infused in our relationships? And here's where society-wide education becomes critical. And this is education in the broadest sense. It's not solely school education, vital though that is. It's about a genuine exploration and learning, truth-seeking in the media we consume, the way we all approach the changing dynamics of the world, especially for those who are beyond school age. It happens through conversations with diverse members of our societies, all ages, races, income levels. It is vitally a process of moral education that cultivates both personal growth and reflective of these new narratives, but also instills, attitudes that value change rather than perpetually seeing change as a threat to our identity or the status quo. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that 40 years ago, on the occasion of the UN's International Year of Peace, the governing body of the Baha'i Faith, it's called the Universal House of Justice, invited all of humanity to consider that a new social order can be fostered by all peoples seeing themselves as members of one universal family, explicitly highlighting the importance of this type of education toward this end. It wrote, in keeping with the requirements of the times, now this is 1985, consideration should also be given to teaching the concept of world citizenship as part of the standard education of every child. So this is the third point of the intervention, which is that the concept of global citizenship. Despite the tremendous structural, social, and narrative barriers it faces, it represents a source of great hope and potential. It's a concept that is easy to say, even not so difficult to engage in at a personal level. But it represents a challenge to the systems, structures, and legacies that proactively undermine the concept. For instance, conceptualizing success through the lens of acquisition of material goods and money, acquisition of power, of influence. This has led to systems and structures that reduce humanity's capacity to see our species as one collective whole, rich in diversity and complexity. It has prioritized competition and self-interest at the expense of the well-being of the whole, and it promotes a false notion that advancement of one segment of society means, almost definitionally, that another segment must lose. A nuanced and sophisticated understanding of global citizenship, then, shows that humanity has contracted into a single neighborhood through scientific advances, rendering the interdependence of nations indisputable. A concern for all the world's peoples does not preclude our concern and commitment to our own well-being or our national well-being. It's actually in both our self and collective interest to be thinking about the well-being of others, just as is the case with the human body. These things are not in competition. Current international activities in various fields which nurture mutual concern and a sense of solidarity among peoples need to be greatly increased, and this is the role of global citizenship education. As the deficiencies in our present understanding, and therefore our collective responses, become more apparent, we have a duty to present and future generations to learn appropriate lessons, to shift our assumptions that inform the structures we operate in and the individual choices we make. And we can do this either by continuing to suffer through increasingly dire global challenges until the lesson is learned, or by acts of courageous leadership commensurate with the needs of humanity today. So to sum up, we've inherited certain underlying assumptions which have to be called into question. Today's challenges are forcing us to reconsider these assumptions, and most importantly, global citizenship is a key component to developing new narratives and structures commensurate with today's challenges. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Perell. I really like the analogy of reconnecting across borders and reinforcing our understanding of global citizenship as us collectively being aware of our stubbed toes and ensuring that we really are hearing and listening to what is happening around us. You tie beautifully into the unity of humanity, as raised by both Brian and Claire. So I'd like to open up with some questions for our three speakers who we've heard thus far. And I think the first one I would like to ask is, what one action can each of us take to move forward the cause of global citizenship? And I'm only going to allow you a minute each on this, but just give us one concrete action, if I can ask, from each of you. So perhaps, Claire, if we could start with you.
Thanks, Nick. 1 minute, because you know I can talk for much longer than that. I think the one action that I would really encourage us to take is to amplify the voices of those around us. I think we all have a role to play in being activists for global citizenship, and we all have a role to play in being allies for other activists as well. So when we have a platform, we should speak up. When we don't have a platform, we should demand it. And instead of thinking about speaking for the voiceless, we should be amplifying the voices of those who are less often heard.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that was incredibly succinct and very important and accurate. Brian, can I hand over to you for one action?
I think that right now, given, and you know, we've had a lot of speakers speak to the COVID pandemic and the inequalities that's created, and really not created so much as revealed around the world. I think standing up and demanding social protections for people around the world that don't have that right now. You know, I mean, I think that what we've really seen is that we're all interconnected through this pandemic. However, we're not all having the same opportunities to come out of that pandemic, and social protections would really help to set that up. I also think that with the education options and the focus on education, that we really need to be getting young people back into school. Social protections really offer stability for families to allow for children in the global south and in other regions to have those opportunities again to get back into education and back into school.
Thank you. Can I also then ask Dan for one comment? I must just say before I do, I'm absolutely delighted that the three of you are joining us today. I have the great luck to know you all personally, and this panel is one I've been looking forward to very much. But I'll hand over to Daniel.
So first, my one action would be to take the two actions mentioned previously. Does that count? No, I would also just add to what they've said, which is to try and move beyond our silos. I think we often take these activities in our spaces where we're most comfortable, but you know, how much do our neighbors know about the work we're doing? How much does our community more broadly know about this work? Because it's easy to be where we're comfortable, but maybe pushing the envelope a little bit with those who may not be as conscious of this work, because it's going to take a normative shift, and normative shifts only happen with growing circles of engagement.
Great, thank you. I think I would like to ask then, it's often said that civil society is the key to change. Indeed, two of our opening speakers made this crucial point about welcoming civil society. You all come from very different backgrounds. Your work in the civil society world is very different. In fact, you're geographically also separated in the case of Claire. What, in your opinion, or why are NGOs and civil society organizations so critical to fixing the world? What is our role in working with member states and governments, and why or how is that unique? So again, maybe if I could go to Claire for a couple of minutes for this. We have also had a request that after this discussion, we take a couple of minutes comfort break before we move to the youth panel. So I will be wrapping this session up a few minutes earlier than planned, but for now we have plenty of time. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Nick. I think that's a really important question, that idea about what really is the role, what's the difference between what civil society does and why we're so crucial. For me, I think this is because we have a long-term vision and we have a long-term role. So if we think about who the different decision makers are and the stakeholders and actors in the system, governments are inherently limited by the political terms of the representatives, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We want to make sure that politicians don't stay in power forever, but what it does mean is that they are very conscious of when they will be re-elected and what those short-term priorities are. We think about companies, they're limited to thinking about the profit being brought back to shareholders. And I think that inherently brings some different timeframes into play as well, even if that's long-term profit. And I think one of the things that civil society that really differentiates us is our long-term vision. We're not afraid to say what we see and what we want and what we hope for, what we wish for, what we're advocating for, no matter how far away it is and how unpopular it makes us right now to say. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as civil society, that sometimes it's those times when we are being the most vilified for what we are saying or doing, that maybe is when we're making the most impact on that long-term vision that we're all striving towards.
Thank you. I mean, I think I couldn't agree with you more. And I like the connection, obviously, as we've heard from Brian, with his direct experiences. I know that Daniel, you've got great experience of working both with the NGO Major Group at ECOSOC in New York, and also, as has been noted, you were the pen holder for the DPI NGO conference on global citizenship. How would you respond to what Claire said, and what would you add?
Yeah, I think, Claire, I was grinning as you were saying it because I felt like you were reading from some of the things I was hoping to get to. So I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think maybe one dimension I would try to add to it is just what happens to motivate us, I think, is quite different to what motivates those who are either in the private sector or in political office, at least outwardly. So, there are many individuals in both of these spaces who do have a really positive motivation, but the metrics that are used, as Claire referenced, are not necessarily commensurate with it. So we sort of have fewer barriers holding us back from genuine collaboration. We don't have these political cycles, these quarterly economic reports and all of this. And these structures can limit the scope of those individuals to make change by no fault of their own. I'm not trying to issue blame. And so sort of on behalf of the thousands and millions of civil servants who agree with us, I think we actually bear a great responsibility. We must both then speak to the systems as they stand to try to change them, but we also have to demonstrate what global citizenship looks like in our behavior and our own collaboration. And this, I think, is one of the areas where civil society has a great challenge, because we're trying to create something that has actually never existed. We have to try to set this example of genuine interest on behalf of all of humanity, which doesn't exclude the different dimensions of that. The constituent elements are super important, but we have to show how those all can be brought together. And we have to do it because we can't really expect that the victors of an unjust system are willing to take that first step. So the current political leaders, economic leaders who have become sort of the victors, the winners of the current system aren't going to be the ones who change it. So we have to show what it looks like. And it's really, as I said, a great challenge, but it's also an exciting responsibility. And I think that's what motivates me and many of us to continue trying to quote, fight the good fight, as they say, though it's a little bit of an adversarial posture. So my apologies for that. But thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Dan. I would actually like to take this opportunity also to welcome those representatives of governments and permanent delegations at UNESCO who have been able to join us today. I know there are at least 3 who are with us, and we certainly welcome you and appreciate your participation. Brian, you are, in at least amongst the people I know, probably uniquely positioned in straddling the worlds of civil society, government, as you say, celebrity, individual leaders. I'd love to add your perspective on this and to follow on to Claire and Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I don't disagree that civil society is able to operate somewhat in a different capacity. However, I do think that there's so much that of the way that we look at NGOs and nonprofits that we are still beholden to donors and how we need to fundraise to operate. And so we do sometimes run into this obstacle where how do we do this work and move the ball forward? And I think that is where I've been very fortunate with many of the Nobel laureates, with the Archbishop Tutu, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, many of the people that I've been able to work with to really be able to both work with civil society as well as luminaries to move that ball forward and to really kind of spotlight what we can do to start doing that. And so that's been sort of my approach to how I personally have been able to do the work. I think that one of the other things, though, is that many NGOs, especially many that are associated with UNESCO, are high profile. And so it really does open the doors. You know, one of the organizations that a lot of us are associated with is Rotary International. I do quite a bit with Rotary International. And because they are a nonpartisan organization, they're able to meet with world leaders. They're able to meet with variety of people from different areas and people that can actually influence change, to have that ability to start having conversations that maybe are more difficult to have than it would be for just, you know, somebody within the offices of those governments or whatever to bring the topic up. So I think that it really does, there's sort of this both and, you know, that we need to continue the work of civil society in moving this forward. However, we have to figure out ways that we can blend that work with faith organizations, businesses, and governments to really start affecting change.
Thank you. I think this has been an interesting and perhaps eye-opening session. And I think for me, the points that has come across quite clearly from all is that whilst I don't think any of us feel it is productive or positive to be to position civil society as being in conflict or against governments, the opportunity for that independent voice is very important and very critical. It actually recalls, I mean, Dan's point earlier about the history of this action and movement. My own organization, the Associated Countrywomen of the World, members passed a resolution in 1953 titled Citizenship, Women's Responsibilities. And it absolutely speaks to all of the things that we discussed today as the ideals of global citizenship. You know, it is participating in political process. It is making sure that we come forward, as Claire said, as allies and activists, standing up for social protections, moving beyond silos, although of course this wasn't the terminology of the mid-1950s. And I think that's, we've come a long way, and I think COVID has shown us just how far there is still left to go. And I think if we look at that, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and global citizenship specifically through the lens of COVID, I think it really has put in perspective the reality of leave no one behind and just how far behind some people are being left in the world, and not necessarily in the obvious places. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this session. After this session, we're going to take a few minutes comfort break, and then we'll start the next panel, our youth panel, at 3:40 p.m. And this will be chaired by my colleague or colleagues from the steering committee, Olga and Thais. Before that, I would sincerely like to thank Daniel Perell, Claire Mahon, Brian Rusch for your very important and powerful contributions to today's forum. And I look forward to being able to see all three of you soon, hopefully in real life as we progress these goals. Thank you all very much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon after just the break. I know we have many people joining us from different corners of the world. Thank you, Nick and others, for a great discussion before. Just a short reminder to all our attendees, you can use and you're welcome to use the Q&A function in a chat on Pine. After this session, we will have time for asking questions and asking our panelists to answer what you would like to know from them. So please type in the meantime all your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. It's also my pleasure to welcoming you to our panel discussion, and in this session we will focus on the education for global citizenship through the EU perspective. As Miss Stefania Giannini, like 1 hour ago, did introduce the concept of global citizenship, I think most of you have heard it, but for those who are joining us just now, I would like to remind you shortly what does global citizen education mean. As you all see, we are now very much interconnected, and this is increasing. But as our previous panelists outlined, the human rights valuation, inequality and poverty still threaten peace and sustainability. And in UNESCO, the global citizenship education is response to these challenges. So the global citizenship education is about empowering learners and also young people to become active promoters of more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, secure, and sustainable societies. So today I have a great pleasure to welcome Ms. Tarindra Aruma-Peruma, Ms. Yasmin Knight, and Thais Queiroz, who are very much connected to young communities and are leaders of promoting the values of global citizenship. So let me introduce to you our panelists. So Ms. Tarindra Aruma-Peruma is joining us today from Sri Lanka. She is an emerging leader representing the Asia-Pacific region in the International Council of the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award Foundation. Tarindra serves also as a board member representing the award in the Global Youth Mobilization for Generation Disrupted program, formed with Alliance of Big Six youth organizations together with the World Health Organization and United Nations Foundations. She has over 6 years of experience working with young people from diverse backgrounds and on grassroots level. She has been able to empower young lives by mentoring them on various projects on leadership, resilience in building non-formal education, and youth empowerment. Welcome, Tarindra. Our next panelist, Yasmin. Yasmin Knight represents today Business and Professional Women International. She is the Vice President of Young Business and Professional Women in the UK. She was also an active member of St. Kitts National Youth Parliament Association for 12 years, where she served as a vice president and head of several committees. And recently, Yasmin began her journey as a data scientist and is actively working on necessary skills for her field. So welcome, Yasmin. And I also have great pleasure to welcome Ms. Thais Queiroz. And Thais is a youth representative of World Scouting, and I think she does it since 2019. She was also a member of the core planning team of the World Non-Formal Education Forum. It was first of its kind event that convened the biggest players in informal education. Thais is also an alumna of the Graduate Institute Geneva, and she dedicated her studies and career on causes of education, migration, and human rights. And Thais will co-chair today's session with me. So welcome, Thais, as well. So now let's move to our discussion about the global citizenship education. And first, I think a warm-up question and a bit personal one. So my dear ladies, Yasmin and Tarindra, what was the moment in your life when you got interested and passionate at global citizenship? And I think, Yasmin, we will start with you.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me today. I think it's actually difficult to pinpoint a particular moment in my life. The concept actually of global citizenship is still relatively new to me, and I don't think I can say that I've heard about it so long ago and thought, oh yeah, definitely I'm a global citizen. If I think back just to being educated in the Caribbean, I think it's a privilege being educated in that region because you come from such a small place. And that means you generally have an outlook on the world itself. You're not always thinking of your own island. You think about things regionally, you think about things in your hemisphere. And of course, you do learn history and geography of all sorts of places across the world. But I can't say even at that point that I thought, oh yes, I'm definitely a global citizen. And then once I was doing my master's and I had an opportunity to study things like sustainable tourism, and then of course learning more about sustainable topics and sustainable development, I think maybe then you could say I started to think about things like, oh, how can I do more and how can I be more sustainable? I'm not sure if I was really aware of the concept of a global citizen, but maybe that's when I really started to become one and started thinking about ways that I can volunteer and things that I can do to make a larger impact across the globe. And I can point to just recently, I participated in 2 hackathons, which were geared at sustainable development topics. It's really become an interest area of mine in terms of being able to make an impact across the globe and becoming more tolerant, being able to collaborate with others in different spaces across the world as well. The hackathon gave me an opportunity to do that and solve problems across the world, which I think is one of the things you want to be able to do as a global citizen.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin. So Tarindra, Yasmin just shared her fascinating story about more like a journey than moment in her life, how to become the global citizenship. How was it with you?
Thank you so much, Olga, for that wonderful question to start off with. And I can really very much resonate with what Yasmin said. It was such an unconscious experience for me as well. So from a very young age, I was introduced to non-formal education programs such as the Girl Guides program and then the Duke of Edinburgh's Award program. So little did I know that these were massive international organizations at that particular age, when we had to do little things like working with others, active citizenship, understanding the world around you, little tasks around that. But then from a smaller age, when we were introduced to this concept, then I realized that we are embracing the attributes we need as global citizens to make sure that we embrace the different cultures around us. And then we think as a whole and not just as one specific unit, just in our country or in our communities, but we make decisions, we respect each other's ideologies as well. So I think getting familiarized with the global citizenship concept from such a young age, regardless of knowing what the concept means, was really laying the path for a future. But then I think I was more sort of interested or introduced to this global citizenship concept when I was elected to the position of being an emerging leader, where I then really had to bring in my efforts and work with the Asia Pacific region, where I was elected to understand the diverse communities. So when I was making a decision or when I was speaking on behalf of someone, I really need to understand that I'm not just speaking on behalf of my country, but as for my region and youth perspective of an entire globe. So it's really introduced me to such a beautiful concept where we can make a positive difference.
Thank you very much.
Okay, go on.
Thank you very much, Tarindra, for answering this. And I'm going to hook on what you're answering, actually to ask our next question, because I would like you to, like, as you described your personal path on becoming a global citizen, what tip would you have for the NGOs that are watching us today for them to incorporate this also in their agendas, in the work that they are already doing. So how could we like mainstream this global citizenship in the agendas of the NGOs that are watching us today? What would you say?
Thank you very much for the question, Thais. One little tip I want to say is when I look back at my younger self, thanks to the youth NGOs, it really helped me see the international perspective through the lens of the organization. So, whatever you're doing right now for young people, keep going on in that path, because we might not really be able to put this into numbers, but it really creates a bigger impact of helping us get that exposure of why we need to even embrace a concept called global citizenship. Because if we are to work with our local communities, we wouldn't be needing global citizenship, right? But when we are a part of an international organization, then we get introduced to the concept of this is why we want it. So what I think is when it comes to like frameworks we use in our or like in all the NGOs, what you can do is you have to like think how you can really integrate these frameworks to make sure that we create active young people who are ready to take on challenges. And the world is always evolving. The world evolves, the challenges evolves, the pandemic evolves, everything evolves. So we really need to adapt our learning or the framework so that we fit into a more upgraded global citizenship concept as well. And a little tip is that we're all doing so much that we really don't give credibility to it as well. So while I was thinking in the afternoon about this whole concept, I was just thinking that if we take a moment just to pause and reflect on the impact we created all these years, then we would understand that we've created change makers, we've created young activists who would lobby for different causes like peace and reconciliation, education, SDGs in action, everything. But then maybe we can just consult these young change makers, which we created through our NGO platforms, and then sort of have an open discussion with them to see how we can sort of streamline our structures. And I think that will create a sense of urgency, which again leads to think about prioritizing what we can do from our NGOs. So it's very important to give that due credibility to the great work we do, and also self-reflect on it and see how far we can take a good leap forward with the change makers we've created from our own organizations. So that's that.
Thank you very much. I really like what you said about having also the international aspect of it, but also the grassroots. And I know we come from similar organizations. You mentioned the Girl Guides, and I'm part of the Scouts. And we have this like international level and the local level of really creating this young people prepared to be global citizenships and be facing the challenges of our world, as you said. So thank you for sharing that. And I also would like to ask Yasmin if you can complement the answer, if you add something, also bringing what the experiences you mentioned about the hackathons you participated. So how can the NGOs mainstream in their agendas this global citizenship education?
I think compliment is the right word, because I feel like Tarita has gone with the entire answer. She spoke mainly about, I think, organizations that are international or have international bodies, and that really brought to mind to me organizations that aren't international, and they don't by default have that reach because they don't have sister organizations in another region or another country or anything like that. So my first tip, I think, would be to foster relationships with like organizations. So, for example, if we were talking about the organization I used to be a part of, which was a youth parliament organization, that doesn't have an international body in and of itself, but there are youth parliament organizations in other countries across the globe. And for an organization like that, just using as an example, if you were to connect with all the youth parliamentary organizations, you foster an era of networking for your members, where you would be able to collaborate and possibly work on other issues that are affecting suffrage in another community somewhere where persons are having difficulties with that. The other thing was in your programming as an organization that doesn't have, again, that international reach by default, you want to ensure that your projects that you're creating for your members are done in such a way that they give them perspective. Because as I've done, I tried to do a little bit more research to make sure I really understood what a global citizen is. And one of the things I think that came out strongest was the perspective that you have on the globe and how you see yourself within the world. And yes, being a local organization, like Tarinda was saying, you have your responsibility there, but it's understanding that it's more than that. It's more than you and your country where you are. And I think if they were to incorporate that, maybe not all, but at least in some of them, so that their members have a more global understanding of the projects that they're implementing, and then they may be able, even when they're networking with the other organizations that they've now partnered with, they have their perspective that they can now share, and then they're able to understand other person's perspectives as well.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Tarinda, for this great contribution. Before I think we move on to the next question, I really would like to stress one tip, Yasmin, you just made about fostering relations, because I think to all our participants watching us right now, this is exactly the perfect moment to build relations with the other NGOs. We have a couple of hundred people here in this forum online, and you can connect. So please make use of it. And this is a very, very good tip from our panelists. But also moving to our next question, and I think it's also connected to what you did say about doing so much, to having so many projects on the agendas in the NGOs, and also the connection between the international and local levels. I think one of the challenges the NGOs are facing today is how to prioritize the education for global citizenship versus other priorities we have in this area. Just to mention like a few of them, it's like a gender equality in education, digital skills education, general inequalities in access to education in regions. How do you think NGOs should deal with this challenge? How to prioritize the global citizenship over other challenges in the education area? So maybe this time we will start with Yasmin.
All right, thank you. As you said that, I remembered one time, I can't remember who it was that was speaking, but looking at a video, and the person was speaking about the amount of content that we now have to digest in terms, from social media, from the news, etc., and that you can't do everything. That was effectively the message, because there is just so much, and there's no way that you'll know everything, be able to read everything, watch everything. And you might want to, and it's great, but you're only one person, you're only one organization in this case. And I think organizations have to think about what is their purpose, what are their goals. So, for example, I'm in the Federation of Business and Professional Women. So their goals are geared towards women and ensuring that women have equal rights and that they are protected and so on and so forth. And I think in that way, organizations can sort of focus their projects and their programs and so on. They may find, like if you're looking at the SDGs, there's so many things that overlap. And in the grand scheme of being a global citizen, you will find when you start doing projects in one area, of course, it's going to overlap on other things, and that's okay. But I think thinking about what is it you're trying to accomplish will help them to focus their projects instead of trying to do everything. But of course, always being open-minded about lending a hand to other organizations is always a good thing as well.
Thank you, Yasmin. And Tarinda, what you would say to this?
Once again, I really resonate with what Yasmin said as well, a very thought-provoking point. And in terms of this, I'd rather change or tweak the question a little bit to say why we need to prioritize the global education system, if you're okay with that. Because one of the main things I want to point out is that a global citizen is aware about where we live in and very interconnected with the world, where many of our actions and choices affect those in the local context, in the national context, in the international context. So one of the main important things is being a global citizen make us aware that we need to respect others as well as ourselves, regardless of where we live in, and also that itself will bring in harmony and can collectively address different local key critical issues. And this will help us think in a way that gives best interest for everyone. So starting from this major concept of understanding each other and being giving so much respect for others, and when we make decisions, it's very important to understand that there's like three domains of learning when I sort of researched about the global citizenship education. And what it pointed out was that the three aspects were cognitive, socio-emotional learning, and behavioral. So I believe most of the organizations are quite in line with these things, because what it meant was how we can reflect cognitive skills in young people, where it can be critical thinking, or it can be conflict management or problem solving skills. And in terms of behaviors, how we need to like really intake the global citizenship concept in terms of behavior and social emotional learning. So I believe what we can do, how we can prioritize, is to understand the key issues that we are facing right now, the issues that doesn't really reflect what global citizenship is about. So understanding these issues and really practicing them and seeing how we can really involve young people as change makers for these will really help us prioritize. So for an example, I'm from the Duke of Edinburgh's Award Foundation, and what we really do is we really create the balanced personalities that can really go out there in terms of solving any issues that they're passionate about. So in terms of creating personalities, what we and like organizations who work for youth development need to understand is that we need to really make sure that we inculcate these attitudes of young people, where they would readily accept the global citizenship. So wherever they solve their grassroots level issues, or like wherever they innovate, that they would think in a more global perspective than in a local context. So that would be my tip for prioritizing.
Thank you very much for sharing this. I think it's as you already showed, there are challenges for doing this prioritization. And my next question is actually related to that, because we would like to understand a bit more for you to share with our public if all youth have equal opportunities to become global citizens. And also, what do you see as being the circumstances that influence this opportunity they have to become youth citizens? So maybe we could start with Yasmin, if that's okay.
I think, thank you, Thais. I think it's difficult to say equal, and I feel like equitable is a better term, because things exist, the internet exists, laptops exist, computers exist, right? And we all know that they exist, but does everybody actually have access to them is completely different. And the answer is no, but everybody does not have access to all of the things that may be required for being a global citizen. If you think about digital skills, for example, everyone does not have access to the internet. And that's a fact of the globe. Everyone just simply does not have access, so they don't. I think it's a shame that that it's not equal and equitable, because it would be great if we could all simply just be global citizens. But then it's now I guess incumbent on governments and NGOs to start looking at ways which they can be providing this access, so that persons can be educated and have access to things like computers, etc., have access to even just things that are in the list of all the SDGs to do with clean water and equal rights and gender equality and so on.
Thank you very much. And before asking Tarinda if you could add something to that, also, what do you see as challenges for everyone, for every youth to become a global citizen? I would just like to remind that you're allowed to disagree with each other, because until now we're always agreeing with each other. But of course, you're also allowed to agree again. But what would you add as challenges that you see for all the youth to become global citizens, and also what influences this?
Thanks, Thais, for letting me disagree as well. Okay, so in terms of the comment or Yasmin, the statement Yasmin made, a very, very like timely, I would say, with the pandemic and everything, and with digital learning taking place. So we have more accessibility to knowledge. But in terms of going back to like vulnerable or marginalized communities, or areas that doesn't really have access, it's more about trying to get young people or youth communities to be aware about this concept. So I would say the one thing we all have in common is the education system, and which is again which the government or like the key stakeholders have a big role to play. So if we can identify, once again, this is an open call or a call to action point for the NGOs, if you can get in touch with the governments and everything, so that we can really push them to understand how important it is for us to inculcate global citizenship to education systems. Because, for an example, coming from a South Asian concept, we mostly focus on formal education, where we really think, theoretical concepts are more important than trying to go back and apply in a practical perspective. So this is where we need to sort of see how and why do we need to, and where do we need to sort of introduce the global citizenship concept. So I would say we can start from the education system, so that we really have a well balanced and a mixed education. Because some of the points we see in the global citizenship education is that it's social and emotional learning, behaviors, and like attributes you need to develop. So most of the things which I don't really think that can take place from formal learning. I'm not saying you cannot, but the tendency can be very low. So I think a good blend of education, if you rethink it, redesign it, I think then we can sort of give that equal opportunities as well. And then making use of in the concepts or the knowledge available in the internet, which we can freely access into, just like Yasmin said, that would bring in that deeper understanding about the world, which we really need at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies. We're just time. So if I, as the representative of the IS, like the old like NGO, would like to conclude and say what are my takeaways, and thank you very much for sharing it with us. First, I think what I have learned from you, it's of course the moment you become the global citizenship, it's not a moment as such, it's a journey, it's a path, and it's like continuous development. And the best is if it starts at the very beginning, and how it was in your case, you become the global citizenship. You become the global citizens even before realizing what the global citizenship is. So that's, I think, very inspiring. And I think also what Tarinda, you said, okay, our NGOs should reflect on what we are doing. Like in our case, we are like exchanging students for internships, but okay, that's our focus, but we not reflect so often. Okay, how does we create the change makers you mentioned, how this is impacting the global citizenship. So I think all of this, like, as a very, very good lesson for all our like NGOs here. Like, okay, it's a journey, you have to reflect. And of course, there are like many challenges, as well as really prioritizing, focusing on the areas, because we cannot do everything at once. So you have to choose what we are focusing on, as I think Yasmin, you stressed, regarding what your organization is focusing on. And yeah, it's a lot of work. And I think if any NGOs is still looking for what you can do, it's still a lot of work in working on this like equality and really having the equal access to the global citizenship education. So thank you very much for sharing your inspiration with us. We didn't have so much time to discuss all of it, but I think both of you and Yasmin and Terindra, you're also on the Pine platform. So I think if any one of the participants would like to continue the chat with you, they can try to reach you. But now I think we can also move to our Q&A session. And I'm waiting for our technical support team to share some questions.
We just got one from Rafael, and maybe if Yasmin or Terindra would like to answer that, and it's about the challenge of languages on becoming global citizens. So how do you see the challenge of languages on youth education? Would you like to take that, Yasmin?
I'm happy to make a comment. I feel like I would need a little bit more clarification on what exactly the person means. But what came to mind was, first of all, when I was studying English being my first language, just to clarify. So studying a second language in high school and remembering that I wanted to actually do both French and Spanish, but couldn't because of the way that the schedules were set up and how it's generally set up when you're in high school and you're only really allowed to do the one extra language unless you have at least 10 people in the class, then you could take the second one. So that was sort of a bummer. And so I ended up doing French. But then beyond that, because you only really learn it in school and it's not really presented to you in such a way that, this is something you can use as a tool for life. You know, there is that global citizenship element missing within there in terms of representing subjects that you choose to study as something you can use beyond the four walls of your school. So I've never practiced French since then and now have French friends and can't speak the language to them. But they're bilingual because their school systems are different. So they know both French and English. And I think that's the challenge. The challenge across the globe is that everybody's school system is different. And the way language, since that's what we're talking about in particular, is presented across the globe is different. So for me, I do think in the Caribbean region, for example, where we do have a large population of persons who are Chinese, a large population of persons who are Latin and therefore speak Spanish, slightly smaller, about the same population of persons that also speak French, but we still only teach English and do not push the importance of being able to speak that second language even within our region. So I think that that's a problem, first of all, because then if we're not even thinking of it as important within the region, how are we going to think of it as important for interacting with others across the globe, you know? And there's definitely a need for a shift in perspective from governments and their ministries of education that are putting together the schedules and the policies and so on with regard to education, to show that the subjects that you're doing, not just your secondary language, but the subjects that you are doing are useful beyond the time that you're in high school, beyond the time that you're in sixth form. They're useful for networking, for gaining opportunities in other parts of the world, for making an impact on the globe that you live in, and even just your region, if that's where we need to start, and showing how it can be used in your region.
Hey, thank you, Yasmin. I think we also have our previous panelists with us, Claire and Daniel, who would also like to comment on this question. So I think, Claire, you can go on.
Thank you so much, Olga. I think this is a wonderful question about the role and the challenge of language in youth education for global citizenship. And while I'm obviously no longer a youth, sadly, I have a perspective on this from my countries of origin. So I'm a New Zealander, and in New Zealand, one of the most important roles that the youth have when it comes to language is the preservation and the growth of Indigenous language and Indigenous culture through language. And so this is something that I see in many countries around the world. I think it's really important that as global citizens, one of our roles, no matter what our age is to be inclusive of all of our citizenry, including indigeneity. And language is that door opener for understanding the world of Indigenous cultures. And it's the youth in both of my countries of origin who are the ones who are holding the flame for Indigenous languages.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to move on to the next question, as we also have. It's a question from Victor, and it's about achieving global citizenship and how important it is to question all and any natural-born identities, for example, tied to geography, ethnicity, nationality, faith, language, etc. Any of the panelists would like to answer this question? I think you also can read the question in our internal chat. I think it's a bit.
I can jump in if it helps.
Okay, thank you, Daniel.
But I certainly don't want to monopolize the space. I think this question is super important. And the first thing I'd like to just acknowledge is that we all hold in ourselves multiple identities. You know, I'm a man, I'm an American, I'm a Baha'i, I'm a this, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, all of these things. And we all hold these multiple identities. And I think what we're trying to do is ensure that they all fit within the context of a global identity as well. It's not a global identity to the exclusion of any others, but it's to sort of overlay on top of or have as a base, whichever way you like to look at it, as this place from which we all begin our analysis of who we are. And again, I'll speak back to that human body analogy. You know, look at any cell, any system in the human body, it has a whole bunch of characteristics that are unique and distinctive and interesting, and that's all beautiful. But it's not the only thing. It's part of a body that has a larger purpose as well. And so I think we should be always questioning, you know, all of these different identities that we have and learning from others and valuing others. And I think it's some of the most exciting moments and opportunities that we have in this moment in history, where we can actually have a panel with, I mean, look who's on this panel. It's remarkable and beautiful. And I think that diversity, that joy of coming together in these spaces is something that we need to embrace. I mean, I think that's the second part of the question, which is love the aliens, cultures, and hybrid mindsets. I mean, I think I learned so much from each and all of you in these spaces, and I look forward to bringing that knowledge to the next one. And I think that these opportunities are not in competition and not trying to undermine our distinct identities, but really trying to reinforce and strengthen them.
If I could just add that, now that I've read the question, I partially feel that love is actually quite a strong word, but I think that you don't need to love something to question, to understand, because that's what you should do. If you're questioning, you should be questioning to understand. You don't need to agree with someone to be tolerant and to give them their own space to be who they are. Everyone doesn't need to agree with you for you to adopt that global mindset and understand what is going on around you.
Thank you very much for commenting on that. And we actually have one last question, and Tarindra, if you allow me to ask it to you. So it came from the French chat, and it's a very hard question to be answered, and it's asking about how to encourage the initiatives of young people for the global citizenship, also in contexts of dictatorships, because there is certain liberties that are prevented, and how to do that without endangering the life of these youth. So I know it's a very hard question, and it's the last one that we will be answering in this panel, and then we have to close. So if you could try to be short, although it's a hard question. Thank you.
Thank you, Thaddeus, for the great question, and thank you for all the others panelists for answering. I completely resonate with the attributes we were talking about. particularly very hard question about dictatorial regimes, but I would say we should think about where it comes from and address the root causes of it through global education. So, so when we create young people, in the path of global citizenship, we really focus on creating a balanced personality who's confident about themselves and who's like, who's out there to do the best for the communities and are really like tapping into the greater potential of them. So in a psychological point of view, dictatorship, like we need to really see how and why it sort of brings out itself. And if we address this youth cause, and obviously we need to safeguard our young people when they sort of go into like, facing these or solving these community issues and addressing these regimes. So in terms of that, I would say it's always best to speak up about these things, and also knowing your limitations as well, but just to make sure that global citizenship is not something that we can achieve overnight. It's a continuous process. So we need to really be putting that effort continuously so that we really make people embrace this concept together rather than leaving communities behind. So we cannot just say that this community follows this nation follows this organization follows this, but rather we have to collectively find ways to incorporate these concepts together. So I would say we'll keep exploring how we can do it, but also just keeping in mind that it's not something that we can learn overnight. And also to add in a very short way, if I can add a little bit to what Claire said, because of being introduced to the emerging leader role, I was introduced to so many cultures, particularly New Zealand. And I was being told about beautiful quotes about Maoris. And I was just thinking how beautiful it is in terms of embracing global citizenship, and how when I lose motivation, I just go and read a Maori proverb so that it really brings that, confidence in me. So it's not about, like not disbelieving in other cultures, but particularly just being open-minded to what other people have to offer, so that we really understand and we can really improve ourselves from these beautiful messages worldwide. So thank you, Thais, for that question.
Thank you, everyone. I think I'm just bumped with messages that we have to wrap up. So thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much to everyone, and see you in a few minutes in the next session.